Here's the revised essay, incorporating your feedback. Imagine a Jerusalem trembling under the weight of two names, Caiphas and Annas. More than just high priests, they were architects of power, wielding influence over every facet of life, from the grandest estates to the humblest homes. They commanded legions of followers, controlled the temple treasury, and believed their authority was absolute. Then came Jesus. With calculated malice, they orchestrated his downfall, silencing what they perceived as a mere dissenting voice, a fleeting threat to their dominion. They sent him to the cross, convinced they had snuffed out the flame of rebellion. But what they unleashed that day on Golgotha was no mere silencing. It was the dawn of a terror that would relentlessly pursue them, a specter born of divine defiance. What was this haunting force that began to plague their waking hours, whispering doubts and premonitions into the gilded cages of their minds? What unseen presence watched their every move, patiently waited for the opportune moment, and ultimately consumed them in ways so horrifying that even the most seasoned chroniclers struggled to fully capture the depths of their despair? These were men who reveled in control, who arrogantly believed they had emerged victorious, yet their lives would unravel in a manner that would forever serve as a stark reminder: no one can outpace the deliberate stride of divine justice or evade its inevitable reckoning. You may believe you know the chronicle of their demise, but the reality surrounding their final days is far more chilling, far more profound than commonly understood. Their final moments reveal a truth so visceral, so impactful about God's unwavering justice and perfect timing, a truth that will compel you to question how often we, too, dismiss His warnings. These men were mighty, but in the end, even their considerable influence proved utterly inadequate against the tsunami of divine retribution they themselves had instigated. So, have you ever truly contemplated the ramifications of defying God's will? Do you sense the subtle weight of judgment in the tapestry of your own existence? If this contemplation stirs something profound within you, prepare to confront the complete, unvarnished narrative of their downfall. What follows may challenge your perceptions, but it is a crucial truth we must all internalize. Let us delve into the terrifying and unimaginable fate that awaited Caiphas and Annas. The saga of their deaths serves as an undeniable testament. No one can silence the resounding voice of God, and His justice, though sometimes delayed, will invariably triumph. Journey with me as we unravel the dark and unforgettable destinies of these two men who dared to believe themselves untouchable, the appalling end that became their final legacy after their role in crucifying Jesus. Let us pause for a moment to consider a chilling truth. The most powerful figure in Jerusalem was not the high priest adorned in opulent vestments, the figurehead receiving the obsequious bows of the populace. No, the true power resided with Annas, the puppeteer concealed in the shadows, deftly manipulating the city's affairs with the subtlest of whispers. While other figures of authority ascended and faded, Annas remained an immutable constant, weaving an intricate web of influence that few could truly grasp, let alone dare to challenge. Annas initially ascended to the position of high priest around 6 AD, a title that ostensibly should have secured his lasting legacy. However, when the Roman authorities relieved him of this title, it did not signify the culmination of his reign. Rather, it marked the genesis of something far more insidious. For Annas possessed something far more potent than a ceremonial title. He possessed absolute control, exercised discreetly and without challenge. He meticulously constructed an empire that remained impervious to outside interference. He solidified his dominion by strategically positioning his sons, one after another, to assume the mantle of high priesthood in succession. Yet, his most masterful stroke was yet to come. In a brilliant display of political acumen, Annas installed his son-in-law, Caiphas, into the coveted position of high priest. Caiphas would maintain this position for an unprecedented duration, cementing the family's iron grip over the holy city for decades. However, a sinister undercurrent permeated this arrangement. What if Caiphas was merely a figurehead, devoid of genuine authority? What if the actual power resided with Annas, always operating from the shadows, the unseen hand guiding every decision? Can you envision the terrifying reality behind this facade? While others labored under the illusion of control, Annas's family remained untouchable, their wealth and influence escalating exponentially, fueled by the constant influx of coins from the temple's sacrifices. Every pilgrim entering Jerusalem, every individual seeking redemption or spiritual solace, unwittingly stepped into the clutches of Annas's insatiable empire. What sensations could possibly accompany such absolute dominance? As Annas surveyed his kingdom, did he perceive himself as God's divinely ordained ruler, or something altogether more sinister? This serves as the backdrop, the morally ambiguous world in which the saga of Caiphas and Annas unfolds. Their rise to prominence was merely the prologue to a significantly darker narrative, a story of betrayal, unbridled ambition, and ultimate demise. But what fate awaited them after they played their pivotal role in condemning Jesus to the agonizing cross? Would the same manipulative strategies they employed to condemn the Savior ultimately be turned against them, orchestrating their own destruction? The answer, as we shall soon discover, is infinitely more horrifying than any human mind could conceive. The temple, in all its awe-inspiring splendor, was not merely a sanctuary of worship for Annas and his family. It was their own meticulously crafted personal business empire. It was a carefully constructed system designed to ensnare every pilgrim who sought to honor God within the intricate web of Annas's influence. Upon entering the sacred grounds, the very first obstacle confronting a worshiper was the imperative need for temple coins. Regular currency was deemed unacceptable. Only the exclusive temple-issued currency could be utilized for making offerings. And who, you might ask, controlled the money changers? Annas's family, of course. They arbitrarily dictated the exchange rates, skimming a substantial portion of every transaction. Did one require a pristine lamb for sacrifice? No problem. Simply pay 5 times its actual market value. Their scheme was remarkably flawless. The people were obligated by religious law to worship. It was a sacred commandment. Every prayer uttered, every offering presented, and every sacrifice made resulted in a torrent of gold flowing into their overflowing coffers, while humble families struggled to afford even the most basic sacrifice. Annas's empire swelled to unimaginable proportions. Rome, meanwhile, remained perfectly content with this arrangement. Their sole stipulations were the maintenance of peace, the efficient collection of taxes, and the guarantee of unwavering control. As long as these conditions were satisfied, they permitted the high priest to manage their affairs with impunity. It was the perfect arrangement for those occupying the highest echelons of power. But then, one fateful day, an event occurred that would irrevocably shatter their carefully constructed world. He, a carpenter from Galilee, dared to enter their sacred temple. Jesus did not merely preach. He acted decisively. When his gaze fell upon the money changers and the animal vendors, a righteous fire ignited within him. Tables were overturned, coins scattered like autumn leaves, and bewildered animals stampeded through the temple grounds. "My house shall be called a house of prayer," he declared for all to hear, "but you have transformed it into a den of thieves." Can you envision the incandescent fury that must have coursed through Annas upon hearing those audacious words? This was not merely an insult directed at their business practices. It was a direct, unvarnished challenge to their very authority. And more alarmingly, the people were listening. They were not merely hearing his words. They were actively following him, believing in his message, and venerating him as a messianic figure. How dare this itinerant carpenter, this audacious troublemaker, challenge the very foundations of the system that sustained their entire existence? When your power and wealth are threatened, what course of action do you pursue? For Annas and Caiphas, there existed only one viable solution: eliminate the threat by silencing him permanently. However, the deed had to be executed with meticulous precision. Too many watchful eyes were present. They could not afford to stage a public spectacle, especially given the considerable number of people who believed in him. They required a clandestine, discreet method to dispose of this troublesome Galilean. Thus, they formulated their plan: a covert trial, fabricated testimonies, a swift execution. Easy, simple, problem definitively solved. But what they failed to comprehend in their hubris was this fundamental truth. They were not merely fighting against a mortal man. They were engaging in a direct conflict with God himself. They believed they were silencing a bothersome teacher, but in reality, they were setting in motion a series of events that would unravel their entire empire and condemn them to a fate infinitely more horrifying than they could possibly have imagined. Pause for a moment to consider this profound truth. Annas and Caiphas were more devoted to safeguarding their wealth and power than to acknowledging the very embodiment of truth standing directly before them, the Son of God incarnate. In their distorted worldview, their elevated positions and vast riches held greater significance than the prospect of salvation. They arrogantly believed they could dispose of Jesus without suffering any repercussions. But in reality, they were unwittingly digging their own graves, hastening their own demise. If you have ever personally experienced God's protective shield amidst opposition, share the phrase, "God defends the innocent," in the comments below. Your words may serve as the very encouragement someone desperately needs to hear today. Just as God shielded his Son from harm, he resolutely defends those who stand firm in their faith, even when confronted by overwhelming forces. Every comment you leave will be lifted in prayer, and your personal story may illuminate the path for someone struggling in their darkest hour. Throughout the annals of history, God has consistently protected his faithful followers, but he has also unequivocally ensured that those who defy his divine will face the full consequences of their actions. Caiphas and Annas were on the precipice of learning this immutable truth in the most devastating manner conceivable. Their punishment would not merely be a political setback. It would be a stark and unforgettable lesson in the unwavering nature of God's justice, a justice that would descend upon them like a thunderclap when they least anticipated it. What ultimately befell these men who dared to believe they could silence the omnipotent will of God? The answer lies buried within the shadows of the night of Jesus' trial, where God's unyielding truth shattered every carefully constructed edifice they had painstakingly erected. Have you ever paused to consider the actual events that transpired when Jesus faced his accusers during that dark and fateful hour? The trial that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of the world brazenly violated nearly every tenet of Jewish law, effectively turning the justice system on its head. Let us step into that chamber where Annas and Caiphas mistakenly believed their actions were concealed from all scrutiny, and witness firsthand how their desperate attempts to condemn Jesus would ultimately precipitate their own catastrophic downfall. Jewish law was explicit. Trials could only be conducted during daylight hours, never under the cloak of darkness, and certainly not during a sacred festival. The accused was entitled to a proper defense, and the testimonies of witnesses had to be consistent and corroborating. However, Annas and Caiphas disregarded the law with impunity. Their sole objective was to eliminate Jesus, regardless of the ethical or legal cost. Envision the scene. Jesus is forcibly dragged through the hushed streets of Jerusalem under the veil of night, his hands bound tightly. The high priest's chamber is dimly illuminated by flickering oil lamps, casting elongated, distorted shadows upon the assembled men. This was no formal courtroom adhering to established procedures. There were no formal charges presented, no opportunity for defense, only powerful men cloaked in darkness, prepared to deliver a predetermined judgment. "Summon the witnesses," Caiphas commands, his voice resonating through the oppressive silence. One by one, witnesses are ushered forward to provide testimony against Jesus. But then, something unexpected occurs, something that throws their entire scheme into disarray. Their testimonies contradict each other. According to Jewish law, a minimum of 2 witnesses was required to provide consistent testimony to sentence someone to death. These witnesses could not even align their accounts of the alleged crimes. One witness proclaims, "He declared he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days." However, another witness contradicts this statement, asserting, "No, he said something about a temple not constructed by human hands." With each conflicting testimony, Caiaphas' frustration escalates visibly. With every passing moment, his carefully crafted plan teeters on the brink of collapse. Throughout this chaotic process, Jesus maintains an unwavering silence. He offers no defense, presents no arguments, and makes no pleas for mercy. His silence speaks volumes, unnerving them far more effectively than any barrage of words could. You can almost visualize Caiphas pacing frantically, his meticulously conceived plans disintegrating before his very eyes. The first rays of dawn are rapidly approaching. Soon, the streets of Jerusalem will teem with activity. Time is running out. In a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, Caiaphas transgresses yet another sacred law by directly interrogating Jesus. Standing before the accused, Caiaphas' voice rises in intensity, his barely restrained anger permeating the room. "I adjure you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." The chamber descends into a tense silence. Even the flickering flames of the lamps seem to momentarily hesitate. Jesus gazes directly at his accuser, his words measured and deliberate, yet imbued with the weight of eternity. "I am, and you will witness the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the Mighty One and arriving on the clouds of heaven." A collective gasp reverberates through the room. Everyone present comprehends the precise implications of Jesus' statement. He is openly claiming to be God incarnate. He has explicitly quoted Daniel's prophecy concerning the divine Messiah. And in that single, pivotal moment, Caiphas' meticulously constructed world crumbles to dust. He dramatically tears his robes in a theatrical display of manufactured horror. What further need do we have of witnesses? You have all heard his blasphemy. But what Caiphas fails to realize is that in his frantic haste to condemn Jesus, he is inadvertently fulfilling ancient prophecies that were written long before his own birth. Isaiah had foretold that the Messiah would be oppressed, afflicted, and yet remain silent before his accusers. Jesus' silence, his carefully chosen words, his very presence, were all instrumental in fulfilling the divinely ordained scriptures. How often do we, too, find ourselves rushing to judgment, completely oblivious to the fact that God's grand plan is already in motion, unfolding according to his perfect design? The men who conspired to destroy Jesus were blinded by their own insatiable hunger for power and unbridled ambition. They labored under the delusion that they were in control of events, but in reality, they were merely participants in a timeless narrative scripted long before their existence, a narrative that would ultimately reveal the triumph of God's unwavering justice. Have you ever felt as though those who oppose you are on the verge of victory, only to witness the miraculous revelation of God's hand of justice? Share the words, "God's justice prevails," in the comments section below. If you have ever been a witness to God's extraordinary defense of you in ways that left you utterly awestruck, your personal testimony may serve as a beacon of hope for someone currently struggling to perceive God's hand in their own life. The greatest irony inherent in this entire saga is that merely weeks following the horrific crucifixion, Peter would stand in the heart of that same city, possibly even before some of the very men who had condemned Jesus, and boldly proclaim, "You killed the author of life," in Acts 3:15, "but God raised him from the dead." Can you fathom the utter shock and disbelief etched upon the faces of those priests who had labored under the illusion that they had definitively resolved the Jesus problem? How could they possibly have conceived that the very act they believed would silence Jesus forever would become the very catalyst for the most transformative movement in the history of humankind? They believed they had succeeded, that the brutal nails, the rough-hewn wood of the cross, and the impenetrable seal on the tomb would be sufficient to eternally silence this troublesome Galilean agitator. But something inexplicable and deeply unsettling began to manifest the instant Jesus breathed his last. The ensuing events would send a glacial chill through the very bones of Annas and Caiphas, the two men who arrogantly believed their power was unshakable, their authority absolute. What do you imagine transpires within the minds of powerful men when the natural world itself seems to rise up in protest against their reprehensible actions? From what they perceived to be a safe distance, Annas and Caiphas stood by, observing as Jesus writhed in agony on the cross, fully convinced that the problem was on the verge of permanent resolution, dying right before their eyes. They had emerged victorious, or so they wrongly believed. The nails had been driven through his hands and feet. The Roman soldiers had definitively confirmed his death, and the tomb had been securely sealed. Everything had been executed according to plan, but the universe, it seemed, had entirely different plans in motion. Then, at midday, at the precise moment when the sun should have been at its zenith. An unnatural darkness enveloped the entire land. It was not merely the passing of some ordinary clouds or a fleeting shadow. It was a dense, suffocating darkness that persisted for an agonizing 3 hours. The bustling streets of Jerusalem fell into an eerie, unsettling silence. People froze in their tracks, their faces upturned toward the heavens, in a mixture of bewilderment and sheer terror. Within the temple, priests exchanged furtive glances of confusion and growing apprehension. "It's merely a dust storm," Caiphas might have attempted to reassure them. But his voice undoubtedly trembled as he uttered those words. But then, Jesus uttered one final, earth-shattering cry, and then died. The world held its breath, and at that precise instant, the ground beneath Jerusalem began to convulse violently. It was not a gentle tremor. It was a cataclysmic earthquake, so intensely powerful that it sent people fleeing into the streets in abject panic. The very earth seemed to react, to violently rebel against the profound injustice that had just been committed. Something significant was unfolding, something beyond the capacity of any mortal man, not even Annas or Caiphas, to control. But the most terrifying occurrence of all unfolded within the confines of the temple. The massive veil that served to separate the Holy of Holies, the sacred space that only the high priest could enter once annually, was suddenly and inexplicably torn asunder. This was no ordinary curtain. This was a colossal, 60-foot-tall veil, as thick as a man's hand, and it served to demarcate God's holy presence from the common people. The very instant it tore from top to bottom, the very edifice that had led Caiphas and his family to believe they were indispensable to the religious system was shattered beyond repair. The formidable barrier that had deliberately kept the people at a distance from direct communion with God lay in irreparable ruins. Imagine the sheer panic that must have instantly gripped their hearts. A temple worker, pale-faced and breathless, would have undoubtedly rushed to Caiphas with the shocking news. "The veil! It has torn itself apart!" This was no mere strange occurrence. It was a deeply personal assault on their power and privilege. The veil was not simply a physical barrier. It represented their exclusive, carefully guarded access to God. It was the very cornerstone of their influence, the singular element that rendered them indispensable in the eyes of the masses. Without it, what were they? What vestige of power did they truly possess? Caiphas and Annas had mistakenly believed that by silencing Jesus, they would effectively maintain their iron grip on control. But instead, they had just witnessed the initial indicators that their power, along with their purported direct connection to God, was being systematically dismantled. The very moment they believed they had irrevocably sealed Jesus' fate was the very moment God tore the veil and set his divinely orchestrated plan into unstoppable motion, forever altering the trajectory of human history. What do you believe was coursing through Caiphas's mind at that pivotal moment? How did he reconcile the very event he had most feared? God's direct intervention, unfolding with such undeniable force right before his eyes. Perhaps it was in that instant that he finally recognized that the power he had fought so desperately to safeguard was already irrevocably slipping through his grasp. And this time, nothing he could possibly do would be able to halt its inevitable decline. But the most inexplicable and unsettling reports were yet to come. As the darkness of night settled over Jerusalem, hushed whispers began to circulate through the streets. Rumors so bizarre and chilling that they sent shivers down the spines of even the most hardened souls. People who had long been deceased righteous men and women, known to many, were suddenly observed walking openly through the city's streets. Matthew 27:52-53 records the seemingly unimaginable. The tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life and appeared to many people. Imagine the sheer terror and utter disbelief that must have overwhelmed the hearts of those who heard these fantastical accounts. Dead people resurrected, walking, speaking, and recounting their stories to the living. Now imagine this sensational news reaching the attentive ears of Annas and Caiphas, the very men who firmly believed they had successfully orchestrated the permanent demise of Jesus. These men, so accustomed to exercising absolute control, now heard that the dead were miraculously walking, that supernatural signs were undeniably manifesting before their very eyes, signs that they had never even remotely anticipated, signs that directly undermined everything they thought they knew about the nature of power. The walls of their carefully constructed world were visibly crumbling, and with each newly reported miracle, their tenuous grip on power loosened even further. In a state of near frenzy, they hastily rushed to Pilate, their palpable fear betraying their carefully constructed facade of authority. "Sir, we recall that while he was still alive, that deceiver stated, 'After 3 days, I will rise again.' We must secure the tomb. Give the order to keep it secure until the 3rd day." They pleaded, desperate to salvage what little authority they still possessed. Pilate, perhaps motivated by indifference or simply too preoccupied to care, acquiesced to their request. Guards were strategically posted at the tomb's entrance, and a Roman seal was affixed to the massive stone, ensuring that no one could enter or leave without attracting immediate attention. It was a seemingly foolproof plan, or so they convinced themselves. Yet, when Sunday morning finally arrived, everything irrevocably changed. The guards, who had been diligently stationed at the tomb, frantically rushed into Caiaphas's residence, their faces ashen with fear, their bodies trembling uncontrollably, their voices barely audible above a panicked whisper. "The stone has been moved," they stammered, their words barely coherent. The tomb is empty." But that was not the full extent of their unbelievable account. They also spoke of a blinding light, an otherworldly force, and beings of immense, incomprehensible power that had caused them to collapse to the ground as though they were dead men. What credible explanation could they possibly offer for such an extraordinary encounter? How could they adequately convey the sensation of standing in the presence of something infinitely greater than themselves? Without missing a beat, Caiaphas immediately sprung into action. He retrieved a heavy bag filled with silver coins and pressed it firmly into the guard's trembling hands. "Take this money," he ordered coldly, his voice devoid of any trace of empathy. "Tell everyone that his disciples came during the night and surreptitiously stole the body while you were sleeping." The guards, undoubtedly still reeling from the shock of their supernatural encounter, readily accepted the bribe. They agreed to perpetuate the fabricated lie. The calculated deception rapidly spread throughout the city of Jerusalem. Jesus' disciples had stealthily stolen his lifeless body. No one would suspect anything to the contrary, but deep within their hardened hearts, Caiphas and Annas knew the unvarnished truth. No amount of silver or carefully constructed lies could possibly halt the burgeoning movement that had already been irrevocably unleashed. The miraculous resurrection of Jesus was the unquenchable spark, and nothing they could possibly do would ever extinguish its incandescent flame. How often do we, in our own lives, attempt to conceal the truth, naively hoping that money, power, or carefully fabricated lies will somehow shield us from the inevitable consequences of our actions. So, as we've explored the chilling tale of Caiphas and Annas, it becomes clear that the ultimate message isn't just about their downfall, but about the enduring power of divine justice and the futility of resisting God's will. Their story serves as a powerful reminder that prioritizing earthly power and personal gain over truth and righteousness ultimately leads to a devastating reckoning. No matter how powerful we may seem, we're all subject to a higher authority. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What resonated with you most about their story? Do you have any questions or different perspectives you'd like to share? Please leave a comment below. I'm genuinely interested in hearing what you think and continuing this conversation with you. And if you found this exploration thought-provoking, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future insights into history, faith, and the lessons we can learn from those who came before us. Thanks so much for watching.